After 730 days of dodging death, Ethan Walker faced a house that had moved on without him. The blue gate moaned, its paint flaking like forgotten promises, and the yard was a jungle of time's indifference. Julia's presence had vanished. No trace of her humming, only a pair of boots left by the door, caked in mud. Beneath the staircase, Lily sat, small as a secret, her fingers knotted around a locket he'd sent years ago. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice a lifeline thrown across a chasm. And in its pull, his world began to turn again. Boots landing heavy against the earth that once felt like his. The engine hissed behind him, then faded into the distance, leaving nothing but the quiet ache of a road that didn't remember him anymore. The town sat low under a washed-out sky, its rooftops dulled by years and salt air. He hitched his old duffel higher on his shoulder. The straps bit into his palm, callous from 2 years of holding rifles and metal doors, and for a moment he thought about loosening his grip. But then he held it tighter. You don't set down the last thing that still feels like weight. The dirt road that cut through the fields used to sing with summer, with Lily's bike tires rattling over loose stones, with Julia's voice calling them in for supper. Now just stretched out, a pale scar winding into the distance. Waist-high grass pressed in on either side, unkempt and swaying in the breath of a late afternoon wind. He could smell earth, old wood, and the gate hung crooked as if someone had left in a hurry and never returned to fix it. His boots dragged against the loose gravel. Every step seemed to echo back at him, the sound of a stranger walking through a memory that didn't fit anymore. By the time he saw the house, his chest felt hollow. The roofline was the same. The small porch sagged a little deeper into its foundation. The swing where Lily once clutched his arm during thunderstorms was still there, though one chain had rusted through and dangled loose. Waiting for something, a light flicker, a shadow in the window, the familiar slam of little feet on old wood. Nothing. He walked up the path. The bricks beneath him were the same ones he'd carried on his back all those years ago when they'd laid this walkway. Julia laughing at how uneven his rows were, Lily chasing after the wheelbarrow. Now moss clung to them, soft green scars creeping between the cracks. His boots scuffed against the surface, and the sound was too loud in the quiet. The porch steps gave under his weight with a tired creak. He paused on the last one, looking at the door. The handle gleamed faintly under the muted light. He reached for it, fingers brushing over a groove carved long ago when Lily had banged a toy hammer against the wood. He twisted, locked, 3 slow knocks. Firm, steady. He waited. The wind moved through the trees, bending them into a soft sway. Somewhere a metal gutter clinked against itself. His own breathing was the only other sound. No answer. He let his hand fall back to his side. A single bicycle wheel lay half-buried in grass near the shed, the rim rusted to the color of dried blood. He stared at it a long time, the hollow shape of a circle that no longer spun, and then his gaze drifted back to the house. It wasn't home. Not anymore. He stood there until the sky began to dim, his shadow stretching long and thin across the yard. He hadn't spoken a word since stepping off the bus. There was no one to speak to. When he finally turned away, the wind caught his jacket, the fabric snapping softly against his side. An old house's tired breath, and he wondered if it was welcoming him or warning him away. The sun had slipped lower, smearing pale orange across the horizon. And for the first time, he noticed how the light caught on the dust along the windows. It made the glass look opaque, as if the house itself had turned its face from him. He stepped down slowly. He turned his head just enough to see the outline of the swing. One chain broken, one still clinging to the beam. It swayed slightly, though there was no wind. It wasn't neglect so much as erasure, like the place had tried to forget it ever belonged to someone. At the gate, he stopped again. His hand rested on the rusted iron, cool beneath his skin. The hinges gave a soft metallic complaint when he shifted it, the sound too loud for a place that had held its breath for this long. He closed it carefully behind him. The street was empty. No cars. No voices. Just the muted hum of a world that had gone on living without him. He stood there, still facing the house, and for a second he imagined the curtains stirring, a small hand pushing them aside. The thought came and went like a flash of heat in his chest. He adjusted the strap on his shoulder, but didn't move. His boots rooted to the spot, as though leaving would make it final, that the life he remembered had ended before he even stepped onto this road. The wind shifted, carrying with it a faint trace of salt from the distant shoreline. He inhaled slowly. It smelled the same, and for some reason that hurt more than anything else. His eyes lingered on the second-floor window. That had been Lily's room. He could still see the way light used to spill from it, soft and warm on summer nights when she refused to sleep, her little head peeking through the pale curtains. Now, the fabric hung stiff and colorless, a sheet of dust holding it in place. He exhaled, a quiet sound swallowed by the open air. For a brief moment, he thought about calling out, a name, a plea, anything to fill the emptiness pressing in around him. But the words never formed. There's a kind of silence that seeps into your bones. And this one had been waiting for him long before his boots touched the ground. He turned finally, slow and deliberate, the duffel swaying slightly against his hip. His steps were soft on the cracked pavement, but every one felt heavy, like walking away from a gravestone. At the corner, he paused again and looked back. The house stood still against the dimming sky, windows blank, porch empty. It wasn't anger he felt, or sadness, not yet, just a hollow echo of something that used to be home. He lowered his gaze to the street, adjusted the duffel one more time, and kept walking. The sound of his boots faded into the evening until there was nothing left but the faint creak of the broken swing, moving on its own in the cooling air. The street stretched out quiet and long, lined with houses that looked half asleep in the fading light. Ethan's boots scuffed against the pavement, the sound carrying in the stillness like something foreign. He kept his head down, her silhouette framed against the warm glow. Her hair, once dark, had faded to a soft silver pulled back into a loose bun. She didn't move toward him right away, just stood on her porch, one hand gripping the rail as if to steady herself. "Morgan," she said, her voice carrying easily across the quiet street. He stopped mid-step. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a greeting. Her cardigan brushing her legs with each careful movement. When she reached the edge of the yard, she didn't come any closer. Instead, her eyes swept over him, the boots, the jacket, the duffel clinging to his shoulder. She didn't look surprised, just tired. "You're back," she said softly. The words landed heavier than they should have. Back. As if the word itself had weight he couldn't carry. He swallowed, but didn't answer. For a long stretch of seconds, neither of them moved. The street was quiet except for the faint hum of wind sliding between the houses. Then her gaze shifted past him to the blue house at the end of the block. He didn't have to look to know where her eyes had gone. "I kept the porch light on," she murmured, almost to herself. For months at first, Ethan's grip tightened on the duffel strap. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The words were still somewhere deep inside, buried under sand and steel and the long weight of absence. She looked back at him, then, her expression softening. "You should sit," she said, nodding toward the low step in front of her house. It wasn't an invitation, more like an observation, as if she could see the exhaustion sinking through his bones. He stood there another moment, rooted to the asphalt, before finally crossing the narrow street. The step creaked as he lowered himself down, the wood cool beneath his palms. She remained standing, her gaze fixed on the empty house across the way. Maybe they both knew that questions were too sharp for a night like this. When she finally spoke again, her voice was lower, as if she was afraid the wind might carry her words too far. "She left," she said simply. "Over a year ago now. Left the little one with her sister." Ethan didn't flinch, though he felt something in his chest go taut, like wire pulled too tight. The woman's hands twisted in the fabric of her sweater. The girl, she sat out there for weeks, right on those steps. Her eyes flicked to the porch of his old house. Every evening, said she was waiting for her daddy to come home. The silence that followed felt endless. Ethan lowered his head, the shadow of the brim of his cap falling over his eyes. He didn't speak. He couldn't. The woman's voice cracked, just slightly, until one day, she stopped coming. The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of waves from somewhere far off. Ethan let it fill the empty space where words should have been. The woman's words hung there, thin and frayed, dissolving into the cool air like smoke. Ethan kept his gaze fixed on the cracked pavement at his boots. He could feel her watching him, not with pity, not with judgment, just the heavy knowing of someone who'd seen too much of life leave people behind. She shifted slightly, the boards of the porch giving a soft groan. "She's with Clara now," she said. "Julia's sister. Over at the old complex by the mill road." Clara. The name stirred faint memories. Holidays with too many voices in a small kitchen. The woman added after a beat. "Not for Julia. Not for Lily. Just for the space between all of them now, stretched so thin it might never hold again." Ethan finally lifted his eyes to the house across the street. The windows stayed blank, curtains drawn tight against the last of the day's light. That sound had lived in his head through 2 years of desert nights. Now it was just another ghost. He rose slowly, the duffel shifting against his shoulder with a movement. She said quietly. It wasn't a plea. It was the closest thing to a prayer this street had left. Ethan gave a small nod. It was all he had to offer. He turned down the road, the matted grass brushing against his boots as he passed the old fence line. His hand slipped into his jacket pocket and closed around the scrap of paper she pressed into it, the address scrawled in hurried ink. As he reached the corner, the wind shifted again, bringing the smell of the sea and something else beneath it, something faint and familiar, the ghost of laundry dried in summer air, of supper on the stove, of a child's shampoo lingering in the hall, and everything waiting in the small apartment with a number 36B on its door. The street narrowed as he moved away from the block he once called home. Houses gave way to low industrial buildings, their windows dim and their walls marked with years of salt and dust. His boots struck the pavement in an even rhythm, the sound swallowed quickly by the growing quiet. The sky had shifted to that gray-blue in-between light, the hour when shadows stretch long but don't yet let go. His fingers stayed curled around the folded slip of paper in his pocket. The ink had already smudged a little from the sweat on his palm, but the numbers were still legible. 36B, a small mark, but suddenly it felt heavier than his entire duffel. He passed an old payphone. In the places with no names, no one wrote letters home. You didn't make promises you weren't sure you could keep. A stray cat darted across the road ahead, its shadow quick against the faded asphalt. For a fleeting second, the sight of something alive moving through this emptiness made his chest ache. He wondered if Lily had been scared, waiting alone in that house, her small hands gripping the edge of the porch steps while the streetlights buzzed overhead. The road curved past the edge of town, where chain-link fences leaned against themselves, and the air smelled faintly of oil and brine. He could see the low outline of the apartment buildings now, a cluster of tired concrete stacked against the horizon. His hand tightened on the strap of the duffel. There had been 1,000 moments on deployment when he'd imagined this walk. The weight of his pack, the sound of gravel, the house at the end. In every version, there had been a door opening, small arms wrapping around his neck, a voice laughing through tears. Not this. Never this. He reached the first row of mailboxes, their metal faces dented and chipped. The numbers were painted in uneven black strokes, some fading, some overwritten. He found the one that matched the paper in his hand. 36B. The stairwell smelled of damp wood and something metallic. His boots rang against the narrow steps, each one creaking under his weight. The building was quiet in that way places get when too many people have learned not to make noise. At the second-floor landing, he paused. The hallway stretched out in both directions, lined with closed doors and flickering lights. Somewhere a television murmured low, the sound seeping through thin walls. He looked at the numbers stenciled on the door ahead of him. 36B. The paint was chipped along the edges. A faint handprint, small and smudged, marked the lower panel near the handle. He stared at it longer than he meant to, his chest tightening as if the shape itself could reach back through time and touch him. His hand lifted to knock, but he stopped halfway, for the first time since stepping off the bus. His breath caught in his throat. The weight of all the miles between then and now settled on his shoulders. He let his knuckles rest against the wood. 1 breath. 2. Then softly he knocked. He held his breath, waiting for a sound from the other side of the door. And then, faintly, there it was, a soft scuff against the floor, quick and hesitant, like small feet retreating into shadows. The sound stilled him. That faint shuffle, so light it could have been the wind moving under the door, struck deeper than any explosion he'd heard overseas. He let his hand fall to his side, fingers brushing the rough canvas of the duffel, as if to remind himself he was still here, still solid. He waited. The hallway light above him buzzed, dimming for half a second before flaring back to life. Somewhere far off, a pipe groaned. But behind the door, nothing. Ethan exhaled slowly, a quiet release that seemed to fill the narrow corridor. He reached for the handle without thinking, the way muscle memory takes over when your head hasn't caught up. The metal was cool under his fingers, the kind of cold that comes from too many untouched days. It turned easily, unlocked. He pushed, just enough to open a thin crack. The hinge gave a soft complaint, lit only by the flicker of a muted television somewhere deep inside. He stepped in slowly, the duffel brushing the frame as if the doorway had narrowed in his absence. His boots met linoleum worn thin in patches, the surface scuffed into pale trails that told of small, quick steps pacing the same route over and over. Then he saw it, unblinking, holding him where he stood. He froze. The weight in his chest shifted, sharp and sudden, like something breaking open after being locked too long. Her knees were drawn tight to her chest, arms wrapped around a limp stuffed rabbit. One ear dangled loose, the fabric worn thin from years of small fingers holding too tight. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence between them was thick, as if the whole room was holding its breath. Ethan lowered himself slowly, the duffel sliding off his shoulder and landing against the floor with a muted thud. He rested on one knee, hands hanging loose in front of him. His mouth opened, but no words came. He had rehearsed so many, all of them scattered now like sand. The little girl tilted her head, just slightly, the smallest motion. Her eyes didn't soften. They didn't harden either. They just stayed, watching, measuring. He swallowed, throat raw, and found his voice low, roughened by more than distance. Lily. It wasn't a greeting. It wasn't even a call. It was a name spoken like a lifeline, pulled from somewhere deep inside, as if to make it true. Yeah, it's me. The words hung in the air, fragile and trembling, like glass balanced on the edge of breaking. She didn't move toward him. He didn't move toward her. The space between them wasn't just a room. It was every mile, every night, every day she had waited without knowing what waiting meant. And in that narrow, dim apartment, with the smell of damp air and old dust wrapping around them, the world went utterly still. Ethan stayed where he was, crouched low, his knees pressing against the tired linoleum. The air in the room felt thick, like stepping into water. Every sound was magnified. The soft hum of the muted TV, the faint drip of a faucet in the kitchen, the shallow rhythm of a child's breath. Lily hadn't moved. She was still curled into the narrow space beneath the table, the shadow holding her like a second skin. Her small fingers clutched the rabbit's worn ear. The fabric stretched and frayed from years of being held too hard. He let his hands rest on the floor, palms open, not reaching, just there. The board beneath his fingers were cool and slightly tacky, the way places get when no one opens a window for too long. His voice broke, then steadied into something quieter. You're so much bigger. It wasn't meant as a line to bridge the gap, just an observation that cracked through the quiet. Her eyes blinked once slow, as if weighing the sound of his voice against some old memory she'd been carrying. She didn't answer. Didn't need to. He lowered himself all the way, sitting cross-legged on the floor. The duffel sat against his side like dead weight. For a long stretch, they just looked at each other, the distance between them measured not in feet, but in days lost. He stopped himself, the question dissolving before it reached her. Are you okay? The words felt useless. She wasn't. No child waiting in the dark for this long could be. Instead, he tried again, softer this time. I missed you, baby. A sound slipped from her throat, tiny, thin. She shifted just enough for the tablecloth to sway against her hair. The movement felt monumental, like the first crack of ice on a frozen lake. Her lips parted. The voice that came out was dry, fragile, almost like a secret. You came back. Ethan's chest tightened until it hurt. He nodded, quick and hard, afraid she might not believe him otherwise. Yeah, he whispered. I came back. The rabbit slipped a little in her grip, dangling between them like a bridge too thin to hold. For a moment, she didn't move. Then one small hand let go of the rabbit's ear, hovering uncertainly in the air before pressing flat against the floor, inching toward him in the smallest, most cautious crawl. He didn't reach out. He didn't dare. He just stayed still and let the distance close one trembling inch at a time. When her fingers finally brushed against the toe of his boot, something inside him gave way. Not loud, not breaking, just a soft, quiet collapse, like a wall lowering itself after holding too long. He lowered his head, eyes closing for the briefest second. letting the touch of her hand anchor him back into a world he'd almost lost. In the dim light of that small apartment, under the shadow of a chipped wooden table, father and daughter sat frozen in a silence that said everything words couldn't hold. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The soft weight of her fingertips against his boot was almost nothing, yet it felt heavier than the pack he had carried across deserts and borders. Ethan let the air leave his lungs slowly, afraid that even breathing too loud might scare the moment away. Lily shifted under the table, the scrape of her knee against the floor loud in the small room. The stuffed rabbit slid down into her lap, its loose ear brushing the linoleum. Her hand lingered where it was, the edge of his boot like a thin line between two worlds. He tilted forward just slightly, not reaching, only lowering himself enough to meet her eyes head-on. In the half-light, he could see the tiny freckles across her nose, the same ones Julia used to kiss goodnight. They hadn't changed. Tom hadn't stolen that. Her lips moved before sound came. A pause, a swallow, then in a voice almost too small to hear. "You were gone a long time." Ethan's throat tightened. He nodded, the motion slow and deliberate. "Too long." His voice cracked on the last word, not from weakness but from the weight of truth settling in the room between them. Lily's fingers curled slightly, brushing against the worn leather of his boot as if testing whether he was solid, whether he would vanish if she touched him too much. He lifted his hand, not toward her, not all the way, just rested it palm down on the floor, a few inches away from hers. Open, waiting. Her eyes dropped to it, wide and cautious. She didn't move right away. The room filled with the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the muted flicker of the TV. Somewhere above them, pipes shifted with the settling of the old building. Then, slowly, her hand slid forward. Small fingers, tentative at first, then firmer, until they rested over his. Her skin was cool, her grip light, but it was there. Ethan closed his eyes for half a second. When he opened them again, they burned, though no tears fell. He turned his hand, just enough to curl his fingers gently around hers, not pulling, not holding tight, just answering. She crawled out from under the table without a word, her little knees making soft thuds against the floor. The rabbit dragged behind her, its ear catching on the chair leg before slipping free. When she was close enough, she didn't throw herself into his arms. There was no rush, no cinematic reunion. She just sat down in front of him, cross-legged to mirror his own posture, brushing a stray lock of hair away from her forehead. His thumb lingered for a moment on her temple, and he breathed out a single, trembling word. "Yeah." The silence after was different now. He glanced around the apartment, taking in the narrow hallway, the walls stained with time and damp air. The kitchen sat just off the main room, its light a pale yellow flicker from a single bulb that swayed slightly as if moved by some old draft. Lily followed him without sound, the rabbit dragging along the floor in her small hand. Her steps were so light he barely heard them over his own. The counter was bare except for a tipped-over cereal box and a stack of dishes in the sink. He opened one cabinet, then another. An almost empty jar of peanut butter, a pack of instant noodles, a single can of beans dented along one side. He set the noodles on the counter and found a small pot under the sink. She gave a small nod, her eyes fixed on the rabbit in her lap. He filled the pot halfway from the tap, the water running with a metallic tang. He turned the stove's knob, filling the silence with a kind of steady rhythm. He broke the block of noodles in half and let it slide into the pot. Lily climbed into a chair at the small table, her legs swinging a few inches off the floor. She didn't look around, didn't ask questions, just sat with her fingers curled in the rabbit's ear, watching him with eyes too quiet for her age. Ethan found 2 chip bowls in the cupboard. When he poured the noodles, the steam rose up, carrying the faint smell of broth. He set one bowl in front of her, the other at the opposite seat. She stared at it for a moment, the spoon resting against the rim. Then, carefully, she reached out, fingers brushing the edge before curling around the handle. She took a small bite, blowing on it first, though it wasn't hot enough to burn. Ethan sat down across from her. His own spoon stayed untouched for a while. He just watched her, the way her shoulders curled slightly forward, the way her lips pressed together after each small bite, like she wasn't used to the act of eating with someone else anymore. Halfway through, she spoke, not loud, not even looking up. It's better than the other kind. He didn't ask what other kind. He just nodded once, the motion quiet. Good, he said, voice low, almost a breath. They ate the rest in silence. Not the heavy silence from before, not the one that pressed down like weight. This one was thin, cautious, like a fragile thread stretched between them, trembling but holding. When she finished, she pushed the bowl toward the center of the table with small hands and whispered, almost to herself, I waited here a lot. Ethan's hand stilled over his own bowl. He looked at her, really looked, leaving only the faint scent of broth in the air. Lily sat with her hands in her lap now, fingers twisting the rabbit's frayed ear. Her feet brushed against the chair legs in slow, uneven swings. Ethan leaned back slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. He wanted to speak, to fill the fragile space between them with some kind of reassurance, but every word felt too big, too sharp for this small, quiet room. Instead, he let his hand slide across the table, not reaching for her, not forcing closeness, just placing it there, open and still like a question without sound. Lily glanced at it, then at his face. Her eyes were steady, but her voice, when it came, was soft as a thread. You won't go again? He exhaled slowly, the breath catching halfway. Then she rested her palm over his, her fingers curling only slightly, as if testing whether he'd stay or vanish like smoke. Ethan closed his fingers around hers gently. Not tight, just enough to tell her, I'm here. The room held its breath with them. No more words came. They weren't needed. There are silences that hurt, and there are silences that heal. This one was the second kind. Lily leaned forward a little, resting her cheek against the edge of the table, her small hand still in his. Her eyes drifted shut slowly, lashes trembling once before settling. Ethan stayed there, unmoving, letting the weight of her hand in his sink deep. Outside the window, the faint sound of the wind brushed against the old building. With the child's fingers curled against his palm and the soft rise and fall of her breath filling the room, he felt the first small fracture in the wall of loneliness he'd been carrying for years. It wasn't hope yet, not forgiveness, just the beginning of a trust, so small it could fit in the space between their hands. And that, he realized, was enough to keep breathing. The bowl sat empty between them, the last trace of steam fading into the cool air. Lily's head had slipped into the crook of her arm, eyes fluttering half-closed. Ethan stayed still for a long moment, letting the quiet settle into his bones. He eased his hand from hers slowly, careful not to wake her too fast. Her small fingers tightened for a second, then relaxed. He stood, joints stiff from the hours of crouching, and glanced around the room one more time. It wasn't a home, just four walls that had held her waiting. The duffel felt heavier when he lifted it, the strap biting into his shoulder. He crouched beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Come on, baby, he murmured, the words more breath than voice. Her eyes opened just enough to see him. For half a heartbeat, confusion flickered there, like she wasn't sure if he'd still be standing when she blinked again. The hallway outside felt colder, the walls holding echoes of lives that didn't belong to them. His boots were loud on the stairs, each creak carrying the sound of leaving. At the bottom landing, he paused. The door to the street stood ahead, its paint chipped, handle worn smooth by too many hands. He shifted her weight slightly in his arms. She stirred, her voice small against his collar, trusting the answer like only a child can. Her fingers curled in his jacket, and her breath warmed the side of his neck. He pushed the door open. The night met them with a cool gust carrying the faint scent of the ocean. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once and fell silent. The world outside didn't notice them leaving, her small arms tightening instinctively around his neck. She was awake but silent, her breath warm against his collarbone. His boots sounded louder here, each step carrying into the still air. The town at night felt hollow, like a shell left behind by something that had already gone. The distant hum of the sea rolled under the quiet, a low murmur against the wind. He passed under a flickering street lamp. The light cut across Lily's face for a moment, softening the small crease between her brows. She didn't look around, didn't ask questions, just rested her head against him as if moving was enough for now. The houses they passed were dark, curtains drawn tight against the night. Every porch looked like his own had, empty, holding only the ghost of voices long gone. His grip on her shifted unconsciously, holding her closer, as though the act alone might keep her from becoming another shadow behind a locked door. At the corner, the wind picked up, carrying the sharp tang of salt. It caught the hem of his jacket and made it snap lightly against his leg. He glanced down at her. A nod, or maybe just a breath. Her voice came soft, almost lost in the wind. With you. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. Yeah, with me. The road bent toward the edge of town, where the lights thinned out and the sky opened wider. He didn't have a plan. No address. Just the steady weight of the child in his arms and the quiet certainty that anywhere had to be better than where she'd been. The sound of the ocean grew stronger as they walked, waves breaking somewhere far below the cliffs. It blended with the rhythm of his steps, the soft exhale of her breath, the faint rustle of fabric where her small fingers gripped his jacket. For the first time since stepping off the bus, Ethan felt something shift under the weight in his chest. Not release, not hope, just the faintest pull toward the idea that moving forward might mean more than just leaving something behind. The night didn't answer him. It just wrapped around them both, cool and quiet, as they disappeared down the road together. The road curved into the older part of town, where buildings leaned into each other like tired men sharing the weight. The streetlights here were fewer. Their glow soft and uneven, leaving pockets of shadow between patches of pale yellow. Ethan slowed as he reached a narrow alley that opened onto a familiar block. Years ago, 3 stories of faded brick and peeling paint. A single light burned in one of the upstairs windows, steady and warm against the night. Lily stirred slightly in his arms. "Where?" she murmured, her voice scratchy from sleep. He adjusted his grip on her, the weight of her small body settling against his chest. "A friend," he said softly. The steps leading to the entrance creaked under his boots. He hesitated at the door, its surface worn smooth where countless hands had pushed it open. His knuckles hovered for a moment, the weight of asking for help pressing heavier than the duffel on his back. 3 slow knocks. The sound echoed in the narrow hall beyond, followed by a pause, so long he thought maybe no one was home. Then, soft footfalls, the scrape of a chain sliding free, and the door cracked open. Thomas stood there, hair mussed, a hoodie pulled over broad shoulders. His eyes landed on Ethan first. Thomas stepped aside without a question. The warm smell of coffee and something faintly metallic drifted out to meet them. Ethan stepped in, the old floorboards groaning under the combined weight of boots and memories. "Upstairs," Thomas said finally, his voice low. "Bed's clean." Ethan nodded again and climbed the narrow staircase. Lily's head rested back on his shoulder, her breath even but shallow, the way children breathe when they're too tired to fully sleep. At the top landing, a small room waited with a single bed tucked against the wall. The blanket smelled faintly of soap and sun, the kind of clean you only get from a window left open during the day. He laid her down gently, brushing her hair from her forehead. She stirred but didn't wake, her fingers still clinging to the rabbit's worn ear even in sleep. For a moment, he just stood there, watching her chest rise and fall. Then he stepped back in the hall, pulling the door to a soft click behind him. Downstairs. The apartment was dim except for a low lamp casting soft light across the small kitchen. Thomas sat at the table, 2 mugs between his hands, steam rising from one. He didn't look up right away when Ethan came down, just pushed the second mug forward with a slow slide of his fingers. Ethan dropped the duffel near the door and lowered himself into the chair opposite. His hands wrapped around the warm ceramic instinctively, though he didn't drink. The heat seeped into his fingers, grounding him in the way only small, ordinary things could. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, joined by the faint sound of pipes shifting in the walls. Thomas finally glanced at him, eyes sharp but not unkind. "How long?" he asked simply. Ethan's jaw tightened. 7:30 days. His voice came low, rough. Felt longer. Thomas nodded once, the way men do when words are too thin to carry the weight between them. Ethan leaned back slightly, eyes unfocused on the wall beyond. "House was empty," he said. The words weren't meant as an explanation, just a fact laid bare on the table. Overgrown, quiet, like it forgot me. Thomas didn't answer. He didn't need to. His voice broke at the edges, not loud, just frayed. Thomas set his own mug down gently, the ceramic making the smallest sound against wood. "You found her," he said quietly. Ethan nodded. "Yeah." His hand tightened around the cup. "But I don't know if she found me." The clock on the wall ticked softly, each second stretching into the next. Thomas leaned back, arms crossing loosely, but they landed like a nail in wood, something to hold on to in the shifting quiet. Upstairs, the faint creak of bed springs broke the silence. Lily turning in her sleep. The soft sound of child's breath in a room that wasn't hers, but already safer than where she'd been. Ethan closed his eyes for half a second and let that sound anchor him. It wasn't peace. Not yet. But it was enough to keep him sitting there, hands warm around the mug, listening to the weight of quiet stretch into something almost gentle. A pale gray filtered through the curtains when Ethan opened his eyes. For a moment, the unfamiliar ceiling pressed down on him, and he forgot where he was. Then the faint sound of breathing upstairs tugged him back. He sat up slowly on the couch, his back stiff, the blanket Thomas had tossed over him sliding to the floor. The apartment was still, carrying that early hour hush before the day remembers itself. He stood and moved quietly to the staircase, his boots soft on the worn steps. At the top, the door to the small room was ajar. He pushed it open with the slow care of someone afraid to wake a dream. Lily was curled under the blanket, the stuffed rabbit tucked beneath her chin. Her hair had come loose in sleep. He knelt by the bed and brushed her hair back gently. Her eyelids fluttered, and for half a second he braced for the question that had kept him awake all night. "Are you leaving again?" But she didn't speak. She just looked at him, sleepy and quiet, as if making sure he was real. "Morning, baby," he whispered. His voice cracked in the stillness. She blinked once, then reached out a small hand, resting it against his sleeve. The touch was light, but it carried more weight than any embrace. Downstairs, Thomas moved around the kitchen, the muted clink of dishes breaking the silence. Ethan lifted Lily into his arms. She was warm and light, her head resting against his shoulder as naturally as if no time had passed. Ethan sat with Lily still in his arms. She stirred only when Thomas slid a plate of toast in front of her. Her small fingers reached for it cautiously, as though breakfast at a table might vanish if she moved too fast. Ethan watched her take the first bite, the corner of her mouth smudged with crumbs. It wasn't joy that swelled in his chest. It wasn't relief, just a quiet, fragile thing taking root, something like trust, if trust could fit in a room this small. The morning light crept slowly across the table, catching the frayed ear of the rabbit, the curve of Lily's small hand. And for the first time in 2 years, Ethan let himself breathe all the way in. The morning stretched soft and slow, the kind of quiet that carried more weight than any words. Thomas moved in and out of the kitchen, the sound of running water and the scrape of a chair grounding the small apartment in ordinary life. Lily finished her toast in small, careful bites, her legs swinging under the chair with no rhythm, just movement for the sake of being awake. Ethan sat across from her, his elbows on his knees, watching her like a man afraid to blink. When she set the crust down, her fingers lingered on the edge of the plate. She didn't look up when she spoke. "Is Mommy coming?" The question wasn't sharp. It wasn't even hopeful, just a quiet thing placed gently in the room. Ethan's hand tightened around his mug. He didn't answer right away. The weight of her small voice pressed against every mile of silence that had stretched between them. He set the mug down carefully, the soft sound of ceramic on what almost too loud. "I don't know." Just her gaze, wide and unblinking, searching his face for something she could hold on to. She nodded once, a small, solemn gesture. Then, almost in a whisper, "Okay." The word was so soft it barely reached him, but it landed heavy in his chest. Thomas leaned against the counter, arms folded, watching the exchange without stepping in. He knew better than to fill a silence that wasn't meant to be broken. Ethan reached across the table, palm open on the worn wood. It took a few breaths before Lily's small hand slid into his. With a faint smell of coffee in the air and the sound of the sea carried through the cracked window, Ethan realized something. Coming home wasn't a single step through a doorway. It was this, tiny movements, cautious hands, and a child's soft voice speaking his name without fear. The morning light touched her hair, and he held her hand like it was the last thread tying him to the world. By mid-morning, the small apartment felt too full of things unsaid. Thomas handed Ethan a set of old truck keys without explanation. No long talks, no advice, just the quiet weight of someone who understood when it was time to move. Ethan lifted Lily into the passenger seat. The bench was worn smooth, the fabric frayed where countless mornings had rubbed against it. She clutched the rabbit in her lap. A world he once belonged to and now barely recognized. Lily watched it through the window, her small face unreadable. When they reached the corner where the road bent toward the cliffs, Ethan slowed. The house sat in the distance, the same blue gate, the same overgrown yard. Lily's voice broke the hum of the engine, soft as a breath. That's home. Ethan's hands tightened on the wheel. He didn't look at her, not yet. It was, he said quietly, a long time ago. She didn't answer. Her eyes stayed on the house until it slipped out of view. Ethan glanced at her then, just for a moment. She was leaning against the window now. The rabbit pressed her chest, eyelids heavy but fighting sleep. He shifted the truck into a higher gear. The hum of the engine blending with the sound of waves somewhere beyond sight. Leaving didn't feel like escape. It didn't feel like closure. It just felt necessary. The road stretched on, and for the first time in years, it wasn't leading him back to war or duty. It was leading him away from everything that had broken and toward a place that didn't yet exist. He glanced at Lily once more. Her small hand rested palm up on the bench between them, open and waiting. Ethan slid his own hand over hers. Not tight, just steady. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, it didn't feel like he was walking it alone. The highway thinned into a stretch of two-lane road, cutting through low fields washed in pale morning light. Ethan drove in silence, the old truck rattling softly with each mile. The air through the cracked window carried the faint salt of the sea mixed with the dry scent of sun-baked earth. Lily had drifted into a light sleep, her head tilted against the worn door. The rabbit tucked beneath her chin. Ethan glanced at her briefly, then back to the road. Every mile felt like peeling away another layer of the life he'd left behind, though the ache of it still clung to his chest. An old diner appeared around a bend, its faded sign leaning slightly, the paint peeling where the wind had bitten it over the years. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a single pickup and a delivery van. He pulled in and cut the engine. The sudden quiet felt heavier than the hum of the road. Lily stirred, blinking herself awake. Her small voice rasped from sleep. "Where are we?" "Breakfast," Ethan said softly, turning toward her. "Real breakfast this time." She gave a tiny nod, still half asleep. The booths were lined with cracked red vinyl, sunlight catching on the scratches. A woman behind the counter glanced up, her smile gentle and worn from years of practice. Ethan slid into a corner booth with Lily beside him. She sat quietly, her fingers tracing the seam of the seat while her eyes wandered over the menu she couldn't quite read. She picked up the fork carefully, cutting into the edge with slow, deliberate movements. The first bite was small, then another, for the first time since finding her. He saw something faint flicker across her face. Not a smile, not yet, but the shadow of one trying to remember itself. Ethan sat back, watching her eat, the quiet hum of the diner wrapping around them like a thin blanket. Outside, the highway stretched on, waiting, but for this small moment, with the smell of coffee in the air and a child's soft chewing filling the silence. The world felt just a little less hollow. By the time they left the diner, the sun had lifted higher, washing the road in pale gold. Ethan adjusted the strap of the duffel in the bed of the truck before lifting Lily back into the passenger seat. She still clutched the rabbit, a faint trace of syrup at the corner of her mouth. The engine groaned to life, and they rolled back on a highway. The road sloped downward now, the faint shimmer of the ocean growing clearer between breaks in the trees. The scent of salt water was stronger here, sharp and familiar. Lily leaned her forehead against the cool glass of the window. "It's big," she whispered, the first word she'd spoken since leaving the diner. Ethan followed her gaze. The horizon stretched wide and endless, a strip of deep blue meeting the pale sky. "Yeah," he said softly. "It's big." For a long stretch, they didn't speak. The hum of the engine blended with the sound of the waves as the road curved along the edge of the cliffs. Each mile felt quieter, not in the hollow way of leaving something behind, but in the slow exhale of moving towards something unknown. A small sign passed on the right, its paint faded but still legible. Esperanza, 5 miles. Ethan let the name roll around in his head. Hope. It felt too large a word to carry, but he didn't push it away. Lily's small hand reached across the seat, resting palm up without a word. Ethan glanced down before sliding his own hand over hers. Her fingers tightened slightly, not out of fear, but with the quiet certainty of a child choosing to trust. The first glimpse of the beach came suddenly, a wide arc of pale sand with the waves folding in soft, steady lines. Ethan slowed the truck to a crawl, pulling off onto a dirt turnout. The engine cut off, leaving only the sound of the ocean and the soft rustle of wind through the grass. He looked at her. "Want to see?" She nodded once, a small, sure motion, carrying the faint scent of salt and wildflowers. When they reached the edge of the water, Lily let go of his hand for the first time since they'd left the apartment. She stepped forward, her toes sinking into the cool sand, the rabbit's ear brushing the ground. Ethan stood a few feet behind her, watching her small frame against the wide horizon. Her small shoes leaving shallow prints that the water reached for but didn't quite touch. The rabbit dangled from her hand, its ear trailing a faint line behind her in the sand. Ethan stepped closer, his boots sinking into the soft earth. The sound of the ocean wrapped around them both, a steady rhythm that seemed older than anything they'd carried here. Lily turned slightly, just enough to glance back at him. "Can we stay?" Her voice was small, almost carried off by the wind, but it held something new, an ask instead of fear. He looked past her to the horizon, the pale line where the sea kissed the sky. The question sat in his chest for a moment, heavier than it should have been. Stay. The word had been foreign for so long. He nodded once. "Yeah," he said softly. "We can stay." She stepped forward into the wet sand, letting the cool water lap at her shoes. Then, without warning, she turned back and reached for his hand. Her fingers slid into his easily, like they'd always belonged there. They walked along the shore together, their footprints weaving side by side. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the sound of gulls and the faint creak of distant docks. After a while, Lily crouched and pressed the rabbit gently into the sand, making a small imprint beside their tracks. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable but intent. Ethan crouched beside her, his knees cracking softly. "What's that for?" She shrugged, her shoulders tiny beneath the oversized hoodie. "So, it knows we were here," she whispered. He stared at the small, uneven imprint of the toy's ear beside their footprints. Something in his chest loosened, quiet and aching. He reached out, brushing a bit of sand from her hair. "Yeah," he said, his voice low. "So it knows." The tide crept closer, the edges of their prints softening but not yet gone. Ethan sat back in the sand, pulling Lily gently into his lap. She leaned into him without hesitation, the rabbit tucked between them. The horizon stretched wide and endless. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't think about where the road led next. He just sat there, the sound of the waves in his ears and his daughter's small weight against his chest, letting the ocean write a new beginning in the sand beneath them. By late afternoon, the air had shifted warm and soft, the kind of light that makes even tired places feel gentle. Ethan carried Lily back up the narrow path, her small hand gripping his collar while the rabbit dangled between them. She didn't speak, her head resting against his shoulder as if the ocean had taken the last of her words for the day. At the top of the bluff, the dirt road wound past a cluster of weathered houses, paint faded by salt air, porches leaning slightly from years of storms. One sat apart from the rest, perched on a low rise with a view of the water. Its siding was a pale blue, chipped in spots, with white curtains shifting faintly in the breeze. Ethan stopped the truck at the base of the path. The house wasn't big, wasn't polished. They walked up the narrow steps, the wood creaking under his boots. The front door stuck slightly before giving way with a gentle groan, the kind of sound that spoke of years gone by, not neglect. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wood and sea salt. A single room opened into a small kitchen and a narrow hallway leading to 2 bedrooms. The walls were bare, the floor worn but clean. Ethan set Lily down gently. She wandered a few steps in, her fingers brushing the edge of the window frame, as if testing the space. The rabbit's ear trailed along the floor, leaving a faint line in the dust. She turned to him, eyes wide and cautious. "Can we stay here?" He crouched to her level, his hand resting on her small shoulder. "Yeah," he said after a pause, the word quiet but certain. "We can stay here." Lily nodded once, then walked to the nearest window. Outside, the ocean stretched endless and calm, the light of late day softening its edges. But for the first time, it felt like a place that could hold one. The house settled around them with the kind of quiet that wasn't empty, just waiting to be filled. Ethan walked the short hallway. He glanced back to find Lily standing in the doorway, the rabbit held tight against her chest. Her eyes moved over the empty space, then up to him. "This one?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan stepped inside, the floorboards soft under his weight. He crouched, running a hand along the windowsill, feeling the cool wood beneath his fingers. "If you want it," he said. She nodded a small, certain motion. Then, slowly, she crossed the room and sat down in the corner, tucking her knees under her chin. The rabbit's ear brushed the floor as she settled in, her gaze fixed on the slice of ocean through the glass. Ethan lowered himself beside her, leaning his back against the wall. For a long moment, they just sat there, the sound of the waves reaching faint through the cracked window. "You okay?" he asked softly. She didn't answer right away. Then, in a small, quiet voice, "It's not loud here." He turned his head to look at her. "Is that good or bad?" She thought for a moment, her fingers twisting the rabbit's ear. "Good," she said finally, the word carrying a weight far bigger than her years. Ethan let his hand rest gently on her small back. She didn't flinch this time, just leaned the tiniest bit into the touch. Ethan realized something simple and quiet. Sometimes a home doesn't begin with walls or roofs. Sometimes it begins with two people sitting on a floor, deciding to stay. By evening, the sky had turned a muted lavender, the last traces of sun melting into the horizon. The little house felt different now, not fuller but less hollow, as if it had recognized the weight of footsteps and chosen to hold them gently. Ethan found an old oil lamp in one of the kitchen cabinets and lit it. The flame cast a soft, uneven glow that brushed the walls in amber. Lily sat at the small wooden table, the rabbit propped against her arm, its stitched smile catching the light. He set down 2 plates with what little he'd managed to pull together, bread toasted over the stove, and a handful of fruit from the small roadside market they'd passed. Lily reached for a slice of peach, her fingers careful, deliberate. The sound of the ocean rolled through the cracked window, steady and low. Ethan watched her chew in silence. The soft sway of her small legs against the chair's edge, the only sign of movement. When the plates were cleared, she followed him into the smaller bedroom without a word, as if it had always been her anchor. Ethan sat at the edge of the mattress. The oil lamp cast their shadows long against the wall, father and daughter stretched thin and close together. He brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead and said, almost to himself, "You're safe now." Her eyes fluttered half-closed, her small voice a soft murmur in the dim room. "Because you're here." The words landed in his chest, quiet but heavy, like the first stone laid in a foundation. He leaned forward, pressing a light kiss to her hair. "Yeah," he whispered, "because I'm here." When she drifted into sleep, her breath slow and even, Ethan stayed sitting there for a long time. The house creaked softly in the breeze, the ocean filling the spaces between the walls. It wasn't joy that settled over him. It wasn't relief. Just a thin, fragile thread of something steady, something that felt like the beginning of belonging. In the dim light of that first nightfall, his back against the wall, knees drawn loosely in, he could hear Lily's breathing now, even in light, the small sound carrying more comfort than any words could. The rabbit was tucked under her chin, its frayed ear brushing her cheek each time she shifted in sleep. The ocean's rhythm reached through the cracked window, low waves folding over themselves in slow intervals. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash through him. It was steady, unlike the days behind him, unlike the war, unlike the empty house he'd found first. He rubbed a hand over his face, the roughness of stubble grounding him in the here and now. His other hand rested loosely on the blanket near her feet, not touching, just there, leaving only the soft gray of moonlight spilling through the window. The house fell into deeper quiet, the kind that isn't empty but full of something waiting. Ethan leaned his head back against the wall, his eyes adjusting to the dim. He thought of the road behind them, of the weight in his chest that still hadn't found its shape. But when he glanced at Lily, her small hand curled around the rabbit's ear, the ache shifted into something different. He whispered into the quiet. Not to her, not to the house, maybe just to himself. "We'll make it." The words were rough, barely formed, but they stayed in the air like a promise, thin and trembling, yet unbroken. The ocean answered with another soft wave against the shore. And for the first time in years, Ethan let the sound feel like a lullaby. The first light came soft, barely a whisper against the walls. Ethan stirred awake on the floor. The thin blanket he'd pulled over himself slipping to his knees. His back ached from the boards, but for the first time in years, the ache felt like it belonged to something worth carrying. The kind of rhythm children only find when they feel safe enough to let go. He stood carefully, stretching his shoulders until they popped softly in the morning quiet. Ethan stepped into the kitchen, the boards under his boots giving a low creak that made him pause out of habit. The house held the kind of silence that didn't ask to be filled. He found the kettle tucked behind a stack of old tins and set it on the stove. The faint click of the burner, catching, was the only sound. When he turned, she was there, barefoot, hair a soft tangle, climbed into one of the small wooden chairs at the table, and laid her head on her folded arms. The rabbit sat slumped beside her. Ethan poured water into 2 chipped mugs. Watching her small shoulders in the first light, he realized something simple. Sometimes healing didn't begin with answers. Sometimes it began with a morning where nothing needed to be said at all. After breakfast, the house settled back into the same soft quiet it had held the night before. Lily sat cross-legged on the floor, near the window, the rabbit in her lap. She looked at them for a long moment before picking up the pencil. Her hand moved slowly, almost cautiously, as if testing whether the paper would keep what she wanted to say. Ethan stayed a few feet away, leaning against the wall. He didn't try to see what she was drawing. The sound of the pencil scratching across the page filled the room in soft, uneven strokes. After a while, she set the pencil down and turned the pad toward him. The lines were simple, a child's careful shapes, a square house with a single window and a door drawn wide open. 2 figures stood outside, a tall one and a small one, their hands touching. Ethan crouched beside her, his knees cracking softly in the quiet. He traced a fingertip gently along the open doorway. "This where we are?" he asked. She nodded once, her face serious in the way only children can be when they're building something fragile. "It's ours," she whispered. His throat tightened. "Yeah," he said, voice low. "It's ours." She leaned the drawing against the wall, just under the window where the morning light could touch it. Then she scooted closer without looking at him, her small shoulder brushing his arm. The rabbit flopped between them, its faded ear catching on his sleeve. Ethan didn't move for a long time. He just sat there, letting the weight of that small shoulder against his own sink deep. The door in her drawing stayed open, the lines simple and steady. In the soft light of the little room, the air had warmed enough for the sea breeze to carry a hint of salt and grass into the house. Lily stood at the window, her small fingers pressed to the glass, watching the pale line where the sand met the water. Ethan pulled her hoodie gently over her head, the soft fabric brushing her tangled hair. "Want to see it up close?" he asked quietly. She turned. They followed the narrow path down the hill, the dry grass brushing against their legs, whispering under the breeze. The sound of the ocean grew louder with every step, a low, steady rhythm that matched the soft crunch of their shoes on the dirt. When they reached the sand, Lily hesitated at the edge, her small toes curling against the cool grains. The rabbit's ear left a faint trail beside her prints, a line the water reached for but didn't erase yet. After a while, she looked back at him, her hair lifting in the wind. "It's not loud here," she said, her voice carrying just enough to reach him. He nodded, the corners of his mouth tightening in something close to a smile. "No," he murmured. "It's not." She turned back to the water, letting the waves chase the tips of her shoes. Ethan stood with his hands in his pockets, the wind cool on his face, and for the first time in longer than he could name, the quiet didn't feel like a weight. It felt like space. By evening, the wind had cooled, carrying the sharp scent of the sea into the little house. Ethan found a bundle of driftwood stacked neatly beside the porch, probably left by whoever last stayed here. He knelt by the old fireplace, softening the small crease between her brows. When the flames settled into a steady glow, Ethan sat beside her. He didn't speak. He just held his hands near the heat, feeling the sting of warmth seep into his fingers after years of carrying cold things. Lily leaned slightly closer to the fire, her voice a quiet murmur. It feels alive. He glanced at her, the firelight catching in her eyes. Yeah, he said softly. It does. She shifted closer to him without looking, her small shoulder brushing his arm. The rabbit slid between them, its faded fabric warm from the fire's glow. Ethan let his hand rest gently over hers, the movement so small it barely made a sound. She didn't pull away. Instead, filling the room with a warmth that wasn't just heat. Ethan leaned back against the wall, the weight in his chest shifting again. Not gone, not healed, but changing. In the dim, firelit room, with a child's small hand under his and the ocean breathing just beyond the door, it felt like the first fragile spark of something worth staying for. The next morning came soft and gray, the kind of light that felt more like a whisper than a beginning. Ethan woke to the faint creak of the floorboards and found Lily sitting at the small kitchen table, the rabbit in her lap, her legs swinging above the worn wood. He moved quietly, his boots making low sounds on the boards. On the counter, a loaf of bread wrapped in brown paper waited, the kind a neighbor might leave without knocking. He tore it carefully, the crust cracking softly in the quiet room. When he set a piece on a plate in front of her, she looked at it for a long moment before reaching out with both hands. No rush, no hunger in the motion, just care, as if even bread needed to be handled gently in this new place. They ate without speaking, the only sound the soft chew of crust and the ocean far off. Ethan glanced at her once, catching the way her eyes stayed fixed on the window where the horizon met the gray morning sky. After a while, she broke a small piece and held it out. For you, she said, her voice small but steady. He took it between his fingers, a quiet weight settling in his chest. Thank you, he murmured. Her shoulders lifted the tiniest bit at the words. She didn't smile. Not yet, but the air between them shifted, a thread pulling tighter, not binding, just holding. When they finished, she placed the last crumb carefully on the rabbit's faded paw, as if saving it for later. Ethan watched her small fingers, the way they moved with such quiet intention. The house didn't need words. The walls held the sound of the waves, the scrape of chairs, the soft breath of a child learning how to belong again. Ethan leaned back, letting the silence stay. It wasn't empty. It was theirs. That afternoon, a blank sheet of paper in front of him, the pencil heavy in his hand. Lily lay on the rug near the window, the rabbit tucked under her chin as she hummed softly to herself. It wasn't a song, just a string of quiet sounds, the kind children make when they're somewhere almost safe. He stared at the page, the first words refusing to come. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because everything he wanted to write felt too big for the thin paper. He thought of Julia, of the empty house, of a little girl under a table holding on to a toy like it was the last solid thing in her world. The pencil touched the page, moved once, stopped. Behind him, Lily shifted, her small voice carrying softly. Who's it for? He turned slightly. Don't know yet, he said. His voice came out low, rougher than he meant. She sat up slowly, her hair a soft mess in the light. Can you make it for me? The question landed gentle but deep. He nodded once, the pencil steady in his fingers. Yeah, he said. For you. He didn't write her name. He didn't write his. Just a single line, the only thing that felt true in the quiet of that little house. I came back. I'm not leaving again. He set the pencil down. Lily crawled up into the chair beside him, her small hand resting on the edge of the paper. She didn't read the words. She just traced the corner with her fingertip, then leaned her head against his arm. The letters stayed there, unwritten and complete all at once. In the soft hum of the ocean and the slow breathing of the child beside him, Ethan realized some promises didn't need ink to last. By late afternoon, the sky had shifted to a soft silver, the kind that made the ocean look endless. The small house seemed to breathe with the tide, the faint creak of its walls sinking with the rhythm of waves below. Ethan stepped outside onto the narrow porch. The boards were rough beneath his boots, worn smooth at the edges by years of salt air. Lily followed, her small hand clutching the rabbit, its ear dragging lightly over the wood. They sat side by side on the top step. Neither spoke. The breeze carried the cool scent of the sea and something faintly sweet from the wildflowers growing along the hill. Lily pressed the rabbit against her chest, and tilted her head back to watch the gulls drifting high above the water. "It sounds like it's breathing," she said quietly. Ethan glanced at her, then out at the wide, moving horizon. "Yeah," he murmured. "It does." She shifted slightly closer, her knee brushing against his. The small touch carried no hesitation this time, just the soft certainty of a child deciding something unspoken. Ethan let his hand rest on the step between them, palm up. A moment passed before her small fingers slid into his, warm and steady. They stayed like that as the waves rolled in and back again, their footprints from yesterday, almost gone, softened into the sand. For the first time, the quiet didn't feel like an echo of everything they'd lost. It felt like a space being built, slow and patient, wide enough to hold two people learning how to stay. The next morning carried a faint chill, the kind that clung to the air before the sun fully reached the water. Ethan found a small box of tools tucked away in a corner cabinet. Its hinges rusted but still usable. In the smaller bedroom, one of the window frames had come loose, letting the breeze slip through in soft, uneven sighs. He crouched there with a screwdriver, the wood cool beneath his fingers. Each turn of the screw made a low creak, a small sound of something being held together again. Lily stood in the doorway, the rabbit pressed under her arm. "Are we fixing it?" she asked softly. Ethan glanced at her, then back at the frame. "Yeah," he said. His voice carried more weight than the words. "We're fixing it." She nodded once, serious in the way only children can be. After a pause, she leaned the rabbit carefully against the wall, as if it, too, needed to watch the work being done. When the last screw turned tight, the breeze shifted, no longer sneaking through the gap, but moving steady against the glass. Ethan sat back on his heels and wiped his hands on his jeans. Lily crawled closer, placing her palm against the cool pane. "It's not broken now," she murmured. He looked at her hand on the glass, small and steady. "No," he said quietly. "It's not." For a moment, the room held a different kind of silence. Not the hollow one they'd carried, but the soft pause after something is made whole enough to hold. Ethan let his hand rest on the frame beside hers. Two palms, one large, one small, side by side against the glass. A promise without words, written in wood and quiet breath. By midday, the sun had warmed the little house, filling the rooms with a soft, honey-colored light. Lily sat on the floor near the small table, the notepad open in front of her. She had added to the drawing tiny lines of grass around the house, a small sun peeking over the corner. Ethan watched from the doorway, the sight of her bent head and careful hand catching something deep in his chest. She looked up suddenly, eyes wide as if caught in the middle of something private. "Can we put on the wall?" she asked quietly, holding the page with both hands. He nodded. "Yeah," he said, voice low. "We can." He found an old nail in the drawer and gently tapped it into the wall above the small window in her room. Lily climbed onto the chair beside him, holding the drawing steady. Together, they slid it onto the nail. When they stepped back, the paper caught the sunlight, the lines glowing faint and warm. The open door she'd drawn seemed to breathe in the light. The two small figures outside, almost moving under the soft glow. Lily tugged at his sleeve. "It looks real now," she whispered. Ethan crouched beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "It is real," he said. She stood there for a long time, her small fingers brushing the edge of the paper. Then, without turning, she leaned back just enough for her shoulder to press into his chest. He let his arms settle around her carefully, not tight, just steady. The room held the quiet weight of something simple but whole. A piece of paper on a bare wall, two figures in pencil, and a child deciding that maybe this was what home looked like when it was just beginning. That night, the air held a soft coolness, the kind that settled gently over everything instead of biting. Ethan sat on the narrow porch steps, the wood warm under him from the day's sun. The sound of the ocean reached steady and low, folding into the quiet like a heartbeat. Lily padded out barefoot. Smells new. Her toes curled against the wood. The rabbit's ear brushed against his hand, soft and frayed. Without thinking, he let his fingers rest over it. She didn't pull away. The last light faded slow, stretching shadows across the sand below. A gull called once, its cry carried far on the wind before disappearing into the wide sky. Lily leaned into his side, a small, warm weight against him. "Are we going to stay?" she asked. Her voice wasn't afraid, just curious. He let his arms settle around her shoulders, steady but gentle. "If you want to," he said. She nodded, a tiny motion that felt larger than it looked. The ocean kept breathing in and out below them, patient and sure. Ethan glanced down at her, the soft fall of her hair catching the last sliver of light. For the first time since stepping off the bus, the word home didn't ache when it brushed his mind. It just sat there, quiet and waiting like the waves beneath the porch. The house was dim, the soft light of the small lamp pooling gently across the worn floorboards. Ethan stood in the doorway of the smaller room, watching Lily curl beneath the blanket. The rabbit was tucked under her chin, its frayed ear brushing her cheek with every small shift of breath. He stepped inside quietly, the boards giving a low creak under his weight. She opened her eyes halfway, that hazy place between waking and dreams. "Sleep," he whispered, his voice carrying more warmth than command. Her small hand reached out, finding his fingers without looking. He sat on the edge of the bed, letting their hands rest together in the quiet. Outside, the waves rolled against the shore, slow and steady, as if the ocean itself was keeping time with her breathing. "Daddy," she murmured, her voice almost lost in the soft sound of the sea. "Yeah." She shifted slightly. The rabbit pressed tighter to her chest. "Don't go." He swallowed, the words catching in his throat. "I'm not going anywhere," he said softly. "Not anymore." Her fingers tightened once around his. A small, sure answer. Within moments, her breath evened, her grip still holding him as she slipped back into sleep. Ethan stayed there long after, the sound of the ocean folding into the walls, into his chest, into the space between the past and what could be. When he finally leaned back, the weight in him felt different, not gone, not light, but rooted. The little house no longer felt like borrowed walls. It felt like it was listening, learning their voices, ready to hold them if they chose to stay. He glanced at the drawing tacked to the wall, the open door, two figures hand in hand, and for the first time, the picture didn't feel like a wish. It felt like a truth already beginning. It felt simpler than that, like breathing after years of forgetting how, like finding a door that was always open, waiting for the courage to step through. And Lily, it folded into it, soft and steady, like it had always belonged. That little blue house by the sea didn't erase what came before. It didn't heal everything, but it became a place where the weight could be set down. A place where coming home wasn't a moment, but a choice made every day to stay. If this story touched something quiet in you, a memory, a face, a name you still carry, share below. Not for answers, not for praise, just to lay it down somewhere safe. Sometimes healing begins when someone else says, "I see it too."